Welcome back. In this video, we shall create a form using HTML and CSS, and we shall validate the input of the form using JavaScript. So we shall have a form that behaves like this, and if I click submit, we are going to have a pop-up here saying enter a valid name. So let's head to our VS Code and start building what we have here. As you can see, we have our index.html file, we have a JavaScript folder that has our JavaScript file, and we have our CSS folder that has a CSS file. And also, my parent folder is on my desktop. It's called form validation. So go ahead, create a folder in your machine and have all of these subfolders in the folder, apart from the .vs code, which will be generated by your VS Code editor, by the way. So let's go back to our VS Code, and first things first, let's have a boilerplate. But I want a Bootstrap boilerplate so I can use few of the Bootstrap classes like Text Center and the rest. So to do that, I would come over here, I'll go to the Bootstrap website, and I would head to the starter template, and I'll copy this, head back to my VS Code, and I'll paste this, get rid of these comments, and you can get rid of this comment too if you want to, but I don't like any of those comments there, so you can get rid of these comments too if you wish. The first thing to do is to link our CSS file, and to do that we head to the CSS folder and the CSS file, and let's set a type attribute of text /CSS, and also let's link our JavaScript file by saying source. Let's go to the JavaScript folder and let's link the index.js file. Now let's save that. And before we proceed, let's change the title of our website to, let's say, form validation, and let's get rid of this hello world. So let's save that. Now the next thing to do is go to font.google.com. I shall be using the Google Fonts API for my website. So I'll come here and I'll grab the Roboto fonts family, and I'll take this link here, paste it in my head tag, and I'll go to the CSS file, open the body selector, and I'll paste this other one there, and I'll set a font size of 13px, and I'll set a margin of 0 and a padding of 0. That's all for now. So let's head back to our HTML file and let's write the HTML code for our form. But before we do that, let's ensure everything that we have linked and that we have set is working properly. So first of all, let me have a h1 tag here that says testing the font, and let's go to our folder and launch our file in the browser, and let's testing the font. The font is working properly. Let's go to our JavaScript file and let's console.log message for the console. Let's save that and let's head to our console deck to see if we have that. Now we don't have that because we have not refreshed our browser. So message for the console, everything is working fine. So our JavaScript file has been linked properly, our HTML file has been linked properly to our CSS file, and our fonts are working just fine. So let's get rid of this. So let's start writing the HTML code for our form. So to do that, first of all, I'll create a section and I'll call this form section, and I'll create a div in the section and give it a class of form div. After that, I'd create a h4 heading tag that's going to say contact form. Beneath that, let me pass in a div with an ID of error ID. This is the div that will pop out that error that says enter a valid name, enter a valid email, or enter a valid phone number. We'll just close it like that. So, but before we go ahead, let's pass in the Bootstrap class of text center, because we want the text of the message to be aligned to the center. So we are done with that. Let's come out of that div and let's create a form tag with a method of post, and let's set the end type to multi-path / form data. So let's create a div for our label and for our input field. So right in the div, we'll pass in our label tag and we'll say class, say label class, and this label is name, and beneath the label, let's pass in our input field for name, and this would be type set to text, the name attribute set to name, an ID attribute also set to name, and the placeholder attribute set to name. So let's copy this div and let's make 2 more copies of it. So the next here will be the email label and the type attribute set to email, the name attribute set to email, the ID set to email, and the placeholder set to email. Let's head over to the last div that we have here. The label will be set to phone, and let's set this to tel, and tel stands for telephone. So let's set the name attribute to phone and the ID attribute to phone with a placeholder of phone number. I think the last thing to do is to create a button tag here that would say submit. Let's go back to our browser to see what we have. Let's head over to our browser and let's refresh our page to see what we have. As you can see, we have contact form and we have our form fields out here already. So we are going to use CSS to style the page before we use JavaScript to validate our form. So now heading over to CSS, let's give the body tag a background color of, let's say, 29387. Let's save that and let's see what we have. Let's go back to our CSS file and let's keep writing CSS. So the first thing to grab after the body tag will be our section ID tag, which is the ID that is set to form section. So to do that, we'll come here and we'll say form section. So the form section will take a background color of white, and let's pass in a width of, let's say, 400 pixels. Let's pass in a height of, let's say, 500 pixels. Let's save this and go back to our browser to see what we have already. Okay, so what we are trying to achieve here, we want the form to sit in the middle and we want the borders here to have a little curve and not look all square. So let's continue right now. CSS, let's set a margin property of 120 pixels for the top, 0 pixels for the right, 0 pixels for the bottom, and 500 pixels for the left. Then let's set a border radius of 25 pixels, and let's set a padding of 20 pixels. And you know, when we say padding without specifying the left, right, or top, it means we are setting the padding for all sides. So we are padding every side of this form section by 20 pixels. Let's save this and let's go back to our browser to see what we have. Let's refresh our browser. And you can see we have our form sitting in the middle of the page. So the next thing for us to do is to style all the elements inside the form. And to do that, the first thing we'll do is let's grab the label tags, and these are the label tags here. So let's style the label tag. Let's say label. Let's set the margin left of label to 20 pixels. Let's set the width to 100% because we want the label to sit on top the input field. And let's set the margin top to 25 pixels. Let's save this and let's go back to our browser to see what we have. As you can see, the labels here have taken 100% space by width. So we have the input fields coming beneath the label tags. So let's go back to our CSS and continue styling. The next element to style will be the input element. So the input element is this. And on our browser, the input element is this. It's this box. So those boxes are the input elements. So to style those elements, let's set the width to 100% also. Let's set the border radius 10 pixels. Let's set the height to 30 pixels. That'd be big enough, I think. And let's set the padding for all sides to 20 pixels. So let's save and go back to our browser to see what we have. Now let's place this contact form label here in the center. To do that, let's go to the HTML file and let's use a Bootstrap class for that. So to use a Bootstrap class for that, I'll just say class text center. Let's save that. Let's reload our page to see what we have. So you can see it's aligned to the center now. Going back to our CSS, the next element here to style will be the button element, and let's give it a width of 100%. Let's give it a background color of this, and let's give it a color of white so that our text will appear in white. And let's give it a margin top of 30 pixels. Let's give it a height of 40 pixels. Let's give it a border radius of 8 pixels, and let's set a border property to none. Let's save this, go back to our page and see what we have. Already looking better now. So let's go back to our CSS file and continue styling. The next element to style here will be the error ID, and like I said earlier, the error ID here will be used to display the error message, like enter a valid name, enter a valid email address, or enter a valid phone number. And to do that, let's grab the ID by saying error ID, and let's set it to a width of 100%. Let's set it to a padding of 20 pixels. Let's set it to a margin of 10 pixels for the top 0 pixels for the right, 10 pixels for the bottom, and 0 pixels for the left. Now let's set a background color of this. Let's set the color of white. No, color of white. And let's set a transition property of all in 0.5 seconds and ease. This is actually going to make that section slide in smoothly with an animation effect. So let's save this and let's go to our browser to see what we have. Now this is what we have. This is not supposed to be here. This is to only show up when we have an error message. We shall be using JavaScript to make sure this happens. So for now, let's go to our CSS file and let's set our padding for the error ID to 0. And let's save it. Now let's go back to our browser and reload. As you can see, that section is no more showing up there. Now heading over to our JavaScript file so we can write the code that will help us validate our form. Now heading back to our index.html file, let's come over to the form tag here and let's set an onSubmit property to a function that we shall create in our JavaScript file. Let's return validate. Validate is the function that we shall create in our JavaScript file. Now heading over to our JavaScript file, the comment is optional. You may not want to write this also. Write our function that we returned in our form tag using the onSubmit. So let's come down here and let's pass in the function which is validate. And in the validate function, let's grab the items in our form that we want to validate. And to do that, so let's say names equal to document.getElement by ID, and let's set that to name. So if we come to our index.html file, we'll see that the name that we are trying to validate has an ID set to name. So this is the property we are using to grab this whole element in our JavaScript file. So let's go back to our JavaScript file and let's grab the email field because we are also trying to validate the email field. Let's say document.getElement by ID and let's say email. There is one thing that we are missing here, which is the value property. So let's grab our phone property by saying document.getElement by ID and let's set it to phone and by the value of that field. And one other variable we'll have to set is the error text. So let's give it a variable name called error text. Let's say error text and let's say document.getElement by ID and let's set that error ID, which is what is set in the HTML file. We are not accessing that by value. Let's define a message variable here as it's set to nothing for now. So the next thing we will do is say error text dot style. Using the DOM manipulation method that we learned in the previous video, .style.padding, you can actually change the CSS style of an element using the DOM manipulation method, and that's what we are doing right here. So we are trying to change the styling properties of the error ID class, which has a padding set to 0 currently. So we are trying to change the padding to 20px. Now let's use the regular if statement to check the validity of our fields. Let's say if name dot length is less than 3, which means every name passed into our form must have more than 3 characters. So if the name passed in our form has less than 3 characters, let's use the message variable that we declared here. Let's set the message to enter a valid name, and that's all. Now the error text, which is this variable for the error ID class now, .inner HTML. The inner HTML function is used to change the HTML content of a web page, still using the DOM manipulation method. So let's say error text.inner HTML, we set it to message. Currently message is enter a valid name, and let's return false. Now let's copy this if statement and let's use it for the next property, which is, let's say if email.indexOf with the @ there equal to the last index, which is the -1, or email.length if the length of the email address is less than 7 characters. Set a message that says enter a valid email address. The next if statement will be for the phone input. So let's say if what the person passes into the phone field is not a number, that's what this means, is NaN, is not a number. If it's not a number, or the length of the phone number is less than 11, let's say enter a valid phone number. Now let's set an alert that would say form submitted successfully. This alert will run if everything here is correct. If everything in the form goes well, this alert that says form submitted successfully will run. And now let's return true at the end of it all. Now let's save that and let's go back to our browser to see what we have. Let's refresh our browser now. Now let's pass in this name and let's submit. You see, it's telling us to enter a valid email address, and that's because the name is up to 3 characters. So you can see now that it's below 3 characters, it's asking us to enter a valid name. So if we pass in Joseph Brendan here and we submit, it's going to ask us for an email address, enter a valid email address. So if I say my email at mail.com and I submit, it's going to say enter a valid phone number, and when I enter this, it's going to say form submitted successfully. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to share.